The bright studio lights blazed down on the glossy stage of Japan's most popular classical music show. Camera crews moved quietly around the edges, while makeup artists did final touch-ups on the panel of judges. Tonight was going to be special, and everyone in the building could feel it. Heinrich Vollmer adjusted his bow tie for the third time in 10 minutes. At 65 years old, he had conducted some of the world's greatest orchestras. From Vienna to New York, from London to Tokyo, his name was known in every major concert hall. But tonight he wasn't holding a conductor's baton. Instead, he sat behind a polished desk as the guest judge on Musical Masters, Japan's biggest classical music television program. The show had a simple format that viewers loved. Young musicians would perform pieces, and the panel of expert judges would discuss their technique, their interpretation, and most importantly, identify the composer and piece within seconds of hearing it. It was like a high-stakes musical quiz show mixed with a talent competition. Heinrich had appeared on the show 12 times over the past 3 years. Not once had he failed to identify a piece. Not once had he been wrong about a composer. The Japanese producers loved having him on because he brought an air of European authority that impressed viewers. His thick Austrian accent and stern demeanor made him seem like the ultimate musical expert. Maestro Vollmer, the show's host, had told him during rehearsal earlier that day, "Our viewers always get excited when you're here. You make it look so easy." Heinrich smiled with quiet pride. It wasn't just luck or showing off. He had spent 50 years studying music, memorizing thousands of compositions, learning about every major composer from Bach to modern masters. His memory was legendary among his colleagues. Some called it photographic. Others said it was simply the result of decades of passionate dedication. The studio audience was filling up now. About 200 people sat in tiered seating, chatting excitedly as they waited for the show to begin. Most were music lovers, some were students from local conservatories, and others were just fans of the program who had managed to get tickets to the taping. Tonight's theme was Young Prodigies, and Heinrich was looking forward to it. He enjoyed watching talented children perform. It reminded him of his own early days learning piano in Salzburg, when his teacher would make him play for visitors to show off his progress. There was something pure about young musicians before they became concerned with careers and critics. The production assistant clipped a small microphone to Heinrich's jacket lapel and gave him a thumbs up. The other judges were also getting their final preparations. There was Kenji Nakamura, a famous Japanese pianist who had won international competitions in his youth and now taught at Tokyo's most prestigious music academy. Next to him sat Dr. Liu Wei, a musicologist who had written books about the history of classical music in Asia. The 3 judges made an impressive panel. 30 seconds to showtime, announced the director through the studio speakers. The audience quieted down and Heinrich straightened his jacket one more time. He had reviewed his mental catalog of classical pieces during the car ride to the studio, but he knew it wasn't really necessary. After so many years, identifying music had become as natural as breathing. The show's host, Hiroshi Yamada, was a cheerful man in his 40s who had been hosting Musical Masters since it began 5 years ago. He had a gift for making nervous young performers feel comfortable while keeping the show's energy high for television viewers. As the countdown reached 0, his professional smile appeared and he looked directly into the main camera. The familiar theme music played and the show began. Hiroshi welcomed the viewers and introduced the panel of judges with his usual enthusiasm. When he got to Heinrich, the camera zoomed in for a close-up as the host mentioned his impressive credentials and his perfect record on the show. "And tonight," Hiroshi continued, "we have some very special young performers for you. Musicians who have been making waves throughout Japan with their incredible talent." Heinrich nodded approvingly. He was curious to see what surprises tonight would bring. In his experience, Japanese young people were often remarkably well-trained and disciplined in their musical studies. The country's approach to music education impressed him, though he sometimes wished the students would take more creative risks in their interpretations. The first few performers came and went smoothly. A teenage cellist played a beautiful rendition of a Bach suite that Heinrich identified before the boy had played 20 notes. A young pianist tackled a challenging Chopin etude with impressive technical skill, though Heinrich noted she could have been more expressive with the dynamics. Each time, When Hiroshi turned to the judges for their comments and identification of the pieces, Heinrich responded with confidence and accuracy. The audience seemed to enjoy his detailed explanations of why certain compositions were structured the way they were, and his stories about the composers' lives and historical context. As the show continued, Heinrich felt that familiar satisfaction that came with expertise. This was what he was meant to do. Music wasn't just his profession, it was his calling. Every note, every phrase, every composer's style was like an old friend to him. Then Hiroshi's voice took on a tone of special excitement. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have our final performers of the evening. Please welcome two very special young ladies who have been creating quite a sensation in classical music circles throughout Japan. The stage lights dimmed slightly, and Heinrich leaned forward with interest. He always paid extra attention to the final act, as the producers typically saved their most impressive performers for last. Please, put your hands together for 12-year-old twins Yuki and Hana Tanaka from Kyoto. The audience applauded as two identical girls walked onto the stage, each carrying a violin case. They were petite even for 12-year-olds, with long black hair neatly braided and wearing matching navy blue dresses that looked formal, but not overly fancy. What struck Heinrich immediately was their composure. While most young performers showed at least some nervousness when facing the bright lights and cameras, these two walked with quiet confidence. They moved with synchronized precision, setting up their music stands and opening their violin cases with practiced efficiency. Heinrich watched with growing interest. Their instruments appeared to be of very high quality, which suggested serious musical training and family investment in their development. As they prepared to play, Heinrich felt that familiar anticipation. He was ready to add another perfect identification to his record, ready to impress the audience with his knowledge, ready to offer helpful guidance to these young musicians about their performance and their futures in classical music. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, everything he thought he knew about music, about himself, and about the nature of expertise itself, was about to be turned completely upside down. The Tanaka twins stood perfectly still on the stage, their violins tucked under their chins. The studio fell completely silent except for the soft hum of the television cameras. Even the production crew seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what these young performers would do. Yuki, the twin on the left, stepped forward slightly. Her voice was clear and confident, without any trace of the nervousness that usually affected young performers on live television. Good evening, everyone. My sister Hana and I would like to thank you for having us on your show tonight. She bowed politely, and her sister did the same. We have prepared something very special for you. Heinrich leaned back in his judge's chair, already running through his mental catalog of violin duets. Most young performers chose pieces that were challenging but well-known. Perhaps they would play something from Bach's double violin concerto, or maybe a movement from one of Mozart's violin sonatas arranged for two instruments. He was ready, but then Hana stepped forward and said something that made Heinrich sit up straighter. Tonight, we will not be playing a piece that you might expect, she said, her voice carrying the same calm confidence as her sister's. Instead, we would like to share with you a composition that has never been performed in public before. In fact, as far as we know, no one outside of our family has ever heard this music. A murmur went through the studio audience. This was unexpected. The show's format usually featured well-known classical pieces that the judges could identify and discuss. Heinrich felt a small flutter of curiosity mixed with concern. What were these children up to? Hiroshi, the host, looked equally surprised but maintained his professional demeanor. That sounds fascinating, girls. Can you tell us anything about this mysterious piece? The twins exchanged a quick glance, and Yuki spoke again. We found this composition in our grandmother's old music collection, after she passed away last year. It was handwritten on old manuscript paper, and the pages were yellowed with age. Our violin teacher helped us understand the notation, but it took us many months to learn it properly. Heinrich's mind was racing now. An unknown composition? This was highly irregular for the show. Usually the producers screened all performances in advance. How had they allowed this deviation from the normal format? He glanced at the other judges, who seemed equally puzzled but intrigued. Dr. Liu Wei, the musicologist, leaned forward with obvious interest. Unknown compositions, especially old ones, were exactly the kind of thing that excited scholars like him. Even Kenji Nakamura, who was usually reserved during the show, seemed more alert than usual. The music is quite different from anything we had played before, Hana continued. It seems to combine elements from both Eastern and Western musical traditions in a way that we had never heard. Our grandmother had written some notes in the margins, but they were mostly in old Japanese characters that were hard to read. The camera moved in for a close-up of Heinrich's face. He was trying to maintain his usual composed expression, but inside his mind was working furiously. An unknown composition that blended Eastern and Western styles? This could be anything from a forgotten piece by a minor composer to something completely amateur. Without knowing the source, he couldn't even begin to narrow down the possibilities. "Well," said Hiroshi, "this is certainly a first for our show. Are you ready to share this mystery music with us?" Both girls nodded and raised their violins. They looked at each other for a moment, communicating in that silent way that twins often do. Then, without any further introduction or explanation, they began to play. The first notes that filled the studio were unlike anything Heinrich had expected. The melody began softly, almost hesitantly, with Yuki playing a simple but haunting line while Hana provided a gentle harmonic foundation. But within seconds, Heinrich realized this was no amateur composition. The music had a sophistication that immediately caught his attention. The harmonic progressions were complex but natural, showing a deep understanding of classical structure. Yet there was something else woven into the fabric of the piece, something that did sound Eastern in its approach to melody and rhythm. As the twins continued to play, Heinrich found himself completely absorbed in the music. It was beautiful. There was no question about that. The girls' technique was flawless, their intonation perfect, and their musical communication remarkable. But more than that, the composition itself was genuinely compelling. The piece seemed to tell a story. Heinrich could hear sadness in some passages, then hope, then a kind of longing that was almost heartbreaking. The way the two violin parts interacted reminded him of a conversation between old friends, sometimes harmonious, sometimes challenging each other, but always connected by deep understanding. About halfway through the performance, the music took an unexpected turn. The Eastern influences became more pronounced, with ornamental flourishes that reminded Heinrich of traditional Japanese music, but integrated so seamlessly with Western classical techniques that it didn't feel like a forced combination. It was as if the composer had naturally absorbed both traditions and created something entirely new. Heinrich realized his mouth was slightly open, and he closed it quickly. Around him, the entire studio seemed mesmerized. The usual rustling and small sounds from the audience had completely stopped. Even the camera operators seemed to be moving more carefully, as if afraid to disturb the musical spell being woven on stage. The technical demands of the piece were considerable. There were rapid passages that required perfect coordination between the twins, complex harmonies that needed precise intonation, and dynamic changes that demanded mature musical understanding. Yet Yuki and Hana played with such confidence and musicality that it sounded effortless. As the music continued, Heinrich found himself in unfamiliar territory. For the first time in years, he was listening to a classical composition that he could not identify. Every few measures, he thought he heard echoes of composers he knew. There was something that reminded him of Brahms' chamber music, a passage that felt like Debussy's impressionistic style, and moments that seemed to channel the emotional intensity of late Romantic composers. But none of these resemblances lasted long enough for him to make a definitive connection. The music kept shifting, evolving, revealing new layers of complexity and beauty that defied easy categorization. The twins were now deep into the most challenging section of the piece. Their bows moved in perfect synchronization as they navigated intricate passages that wove around each other like dancers. Heinrich could see the concentration on their faces, but also something more. They weren't just playing this music. They were living it, feeling every note and phrase as if it were part of their own emotional language. The camera occasionally cut to the audience, showing faces filled with wonder and concentration. These weren't just polite expressions of people trying to appreciate classical music. These were faces of people genuinely moved by what they were hearing. Heinrich glanced at his fellow judges. Dr. Liu Wei was scribbling notes frantically, his scholar's instincts fully engaged. Kenji Nakamura was listening with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for his own students' most important performances. Both men looked as puzzled and fascinated as Heinrich felt. As the piece moved toward what seemed to be its conclusion, the music became even more emotionally intense. The twins played with a maturity that seemed impossible for their age, drawing sounds from their violins that spoke of deep human experiences far beyond their 12 years. And then, with a final haunting chord that seemed to hover in the air long after the sound had actually stopped, the performance was over. The silence that followed the twins' performance felt almost sacred. For several seconds, nobody moved. The studio audience seemed afraid to break the spell that the music had cast over everyone. Even the camera operators stayed perfectly still, as if any movement might disturb something precious hanging in the air. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with just one person clapping softly, then spread through the studio like ripples on water. Within moments, the entire audience was on their feet, giving the 12-year-old twins a standing ovation that went on for nearly a full minute. Heinrich found himself clapping too, though his mind was spinning. In 50 years of professional music, he had rarely heard a performance that moved him so deeply. The technical skill was impressive, but it was the emotional depth that left him shaken. These children had just played something that seemed to come from the very soul of music itself. Yuki and Hana stood quietly on stage, accepting the applause with the same calm composure they had shown throughout their performance. They smiled politely and bowed, but there was something in their eyes that suggested they knew exactly what they had just accomplished. As the applause finally died down, Hiroshi stepped forward with his microphone. His usual cheerful television personality was still there, but Heinrich could see that the host had been genuinely affected by what he had just heard. "That was absolutely extraordinary," Hiroshi said, his voice carrying more emotion than usual. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that was one of the most beautiful performances we have ever had on this show." More applause rippled through the audience. Heinrich noticed that several people in the front rows had tears in their eyes. Even some of the production crew members were wiping their faces with tissues. "Now," Hiroshi continued, turning toward the judges' panel, "let's hear what our expert panel has to say about this remarkable performance." This was the moment Heinrich had been dreading since the music ended. For the first time in his television career, he had absolutely no idea what he was going to say about identifying the piece. Usually, by this point in any performance, he would have already formulated his response, ready to name the composer, the specific work, often even the year it was written and the circumstances of its composition. But tonight was different. Tonight he had nothing. Hiroshi looked directly at Heinrich first, as was the show's tradition. "Maestro Vollmer, you're our expert on European classical tradition. What can you tell us about this beautiful piece?" The camera zoomed in on Heinrich's face, and millions of viewers across Japan could see him clearly. He opened his mouth to speak, then paused. For just a moment, he hoped that somehow the right answer would come to him, the way it always had before, but his mind remained blank. "Well," Heinrich began, his Austrian accent seeming thicker than usual, "this is certainly a very accomplished composition." He was stalling for time, hoping that something would click. The music had sounded familiar in places, but not familiar enough to pin down. He cleared his throat and continued. "The technical demands were considerable, and these young ladies handled them with remarkable skill." Hiroshi nodded politely, but Heinrich could see in the host's eyes that this wasn't the kind of detailed identification the show's viewers expected. Everyone was waiting for him to name the composer and piece, to share fascinating historical details, to demonstrate the encyclopedic knowledge that had made him famous. "The harmonic structure," Heinrich continued, grasping for something more substantial to say, "reminds me of late Romantic period composition, perhaps influenced by," he trailed off. He had been about to say Brahms, but that wasn't quite right. The music had reminded him of several different composers at different moments, but never consistently enough to make a confident identification. A bead of sweat appeared on his forehead. Under the hot studio lights, with cameras focused on his face and hundreds of people waiting for his expert opinion, Heinrich felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine uncertainty. "Maestro?" Hiroshi prompted gently. "Can you identify the specific piece for us?" This was it. This was the moment when Heinrich Vollmer, who had never failed to identify a piece on this show, who had built his television reputation on his infallible musical memory, would have to admit that he didn't know. "I believe," he said slowly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. This might be an obscure work by Johannes Brahms, perhaps from his later chamber music period. The words felt wrong even as he said them. It was a guess, nothing more, and not even a very good guess. But he had to say something. He couldn't just sit there silent in front of all those viewers. Yuki, the twin who had spoken earlier, stepped forward slightly. Her voice was polite but clear. "I'm sorry, Maestro Vollmer, but this piece was not composed by Brahms." Heinrich felt his stomach drop. He had been wrong. On live television, in front of millions of people, he had been wrong. "Of course," he said quickly, trying to recover. "I meant to say it was influenced by Brahms, but perhaps... Could this be an unknown work by Claude Debussy? The impressionistic elements in the middle section suggest..." Again, Yuki shook her head gently. "No, sir. It was not composed by Debussy either." The camera was still focused on Heinrich's face, capturing every moment of his growing discomfort. He could feel sweat beginning to form on his upper lip. His shirt collar felt too tight. For the first time in his professional life, he was experiencing what it felt like to be publicly, undeniably wrong about music. Perhaps he tried once more, his voice now noticeably shaky. This could be a lesser-known work by Antonin Dvořák. The way it combines different cultural musical elements might suggest... "No, Maestro," Hanna spoke up this time, her voice as gentle and respectful as her sister's. It was not composed by Dvořák. The studio had become uncomfortably quiet. The audience seemed to sense that something unprecedented was happening. Heinrich Vollmer, the man who knew everything about classical music, was struggling like a student taking a test he hadn't prepared for. Heinrich looked desperately at his fellow judges, hoping one of them might jump in to help him. But Dr. Liu Wei and Kenji Nakamura appeared just as puzzled as he was. Dr. Liu was frantically flipping through his mental catalog of obscure compositions, while Kenji looked like he was trying to place the Eastern musical elements they had all heard in the piece. Hiroshi, professional to the core, tried to keep the show moving. "Well, this certainly is a mystery piece. Perhaps our other judges might have some insights." But before Dr. Liu or Kenji could speak, Heinrich made one more desperate attempt. His reputation, his professional pride, his entire television persona was crumbling in front of millions of viewers. He had to try something. "Could this possibly be," he said, his voice now clearly strained, "a recently discovered manuscript? Perhaps by a composer whose work was lost during the war years? The style suggests European training, but with influences that might indicate..." He was rambling now, throwing out possibilities without any real conviction behind them. Each word he spoke seemed to dig him deeper into his humiliation. Both twins remained politely silent until he finished speaking. Then Yuki stepped forward once more. "Maestro Vollmer," she said, her young voice carrying a surprising note of kindness. "Would you like us to tell you who really composed this piece?" Heinrich looked at her, then at the cameras, then at the hundreds of faces in the studio audience. For 50 years he had been the one with the answers. He had been the expert, the authority, the man who could identify any piece of classical music ever written. But tonight, he was just a confused old man who didn't know what he was listening to. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Please tell us who composed his beautiful music." The twins looked at each other for a moment, sharing one of those silent conversations that only close siblings can have. The entire studio waited in absolute silence. Heinrich sat frozen in his chair, his face pale and damp with perspiration. He had just asked two 12-year-old children to tell him something about music that he, a world-renowned conductor, could not figure out on his own. Yuki stepped forward first, her violin still tucked under her arm. Despite her young age, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed far beyond her years. "The composer of this piece," she began, her clear voice carrying easily through the quiet studio, "was our grandmother, Emiko Tanaka." A collective gasp went through the audience. Heinrich felt his mouth fall open slightly. Their grandmother? This sophisticated, deeply moving composition had been written by someone's grandmother? Hanna moved to stand beside her sister. "Our grandmother passed away 13 months ago, when we were 11 years old. After the funeral, when our family was going through her belongings, we found boxes and boxes of old sheet music in her closet. Most of it was music she had collected over the years," Yuki continued. "Pieces by famous composers that she had played when she was younger. But there were also several compositions written in her own handwriting. This was one of them. Heinrich's mind was reeling. A grandmother who composed classical music? This was not what he had expected at all. He looked around at his fellow judges and saw his own confusion reflected in their faces. Dr. Liu Wei leaned forward in his chair, his scholarly instincts fully engaged. "Can you tell us more about your grandmother's musical background?" he asked. The twins nodded and Hana began to speak. "Our grandmother was born in 1925 in Tokyo. When she was 18 years old, she won a scholarship to study music in Vienna, Austria." Heinrich's eyebrows shot up. Vienna in 1943 would have been right in the middle of World War II. What was a young Japanese woman doing studying music in wartime Europe? She studied composition and piano at the Vienna Conservatory from 1943 to 1945, Yuki explained. According to the letters we found in her music box, she was one of only 3 women in the entire composition program, and the only student from Asia. The camera moved in for a close-up of Heinrich's face. His expression had completely changed from embarrassment to fascination. As someone who had spent his entire career in European classical music, he knew how exceptional it would have been for a young Japanese woman to be studying composition in Vienna during those years. But then the war ended, Hana continued, and everything changed. The political situation became very complicated for Japanese people in Europe. Our grandmother had to return to Japan very quickly, before she could finish her final compositions or graduate from the conservatory. Heinrich found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in this story. A Japanese woman studying composition in Vienna during the war years, forced to leave before completing her studies. It was like discovering a lost chapter of musical history. When she came back to Japan, Yuki said, she tried to continue her musical career. But things were very different here in the 1940s and 1950s. There were very few opportunities for women composers, especially ones who wanted to write in the European classical style. The audience was hanging on every word. Even the production crew had stopped their usual bustling around and were listening intently to this unexpected history lesson. She got married to our grandfather in 1948, Hana explained. He was a kind man who supported her music, but he also needed her to help run his family's small business. Between working and raising 4 children, including our father, she didn't have much time for composing. Heinrich felt a wave of sadness wash over him. How many talented musicians throughout history had been forced to abandon their artistic dreams because of circumstances beyond their control? How many brilliant compositions had never been written because their creators couldn't find the time or opportunity? But she never stopped completely, Yuki said with a small smile. According to our father, she would wake up very early in the morning, sometimes at 4 or 5 o'clock, and compose for an hour or 2 before anyone else in the house got up. She wrote in secret, Hana added. She kept all her compositions in a wooden box in her bedroom closet. Our father says he remembers hearing her play piano softly in the early morning when he was a child, but he never knew she was playing her own music. The camera panned across the studio audience, showing faces filled with emotion. Several people were wiping their eyes. This wasn't just a story about music anymore. It was a story about dreams deferred, about talent hidden, about a woman who never stopped creating even when the world seemed to have no place for her art. Heinrich realized that his own eyes were getting misty. He had been so focused on his embarrassment at not knowing the piece that he had almost missed the real significance of what was happening. This wasn't just about his failure to identify a composition. This was about the discovery of a lost voice in classical music. We started learning this piece about 8 months ago, Yuki continued. Our violin teacher, Tanaka-sensei, helped us figure out some of the more difficult notation. Our grandmother's handwriting was sometimes hard to read, and she used some musical symbols that are not common anymore. It took us a long time to understand the piece properly, Hana said. The way she combined Japanese musical ideas with European classical techniques was very sophisticated. We had to learn about both traditions to really play it the way she intended. Heinrich found his voice at last. How many compositions did your grandmother leave behind? He asked, his curiosity overcoming his embarrassed. We found 17 complete pieces, Yuki replied. Some are for piano solo, some are for small groups of instruments, and 3 are for full orchestra, though we've never heard those ones played. 17 pieces. Heinrich's mind was spinning. If this one composition was any indication of the quality of the others, they had just discovered a significant body of work by a composer who had been completely unknown to the classical music world. Dr. Liu Wei was scribbling notes frantically. "Have any of these compositions ever been performed publicly before tonight?" he asked. Both girls shook their heads. "Tonight was the first time anyone outside our family has heard grandmother's music," Hannah said. The weight of that statement settled over the studio. Millions of people watching on television had just witnessed the world premiere of a composition that had been hidden in a closet for decades. They had heard the first public performance of music written by a woman whose talent had been lost to history. Heinrich realized that his humiliation suddenly seemed much less important. Yes, he had failed to identify the piece. Yes, his reputation as an infallible musical expert had been damaged. But something much more significant had happened tonight. "Why did you decide to perform this piece without telling us who composed it?" Kenji Nakamura asked gently. The twins exchanged another of their silent looks before Yuki answered. "We wanted to see if people would think grandmother's music was beautiful, just because it was beautiful. Not because of who wrote it or when it was written. We thought that if we told everyone it was composed by our grandmother, people might not take it seriously," Hannah added. "But if the music spoke for itself first, then people would judge it fairly." Heinrich felt a deep shame wash over him, followed immediately by profound respect. These children had understood something about music and prejudice that he, with all his experience and education, had never fully grasped. They had known that their grandmother's work would be judged differently if people knew it was written by a Japanese housewife rather than a famous European composer, and they had been absolutely right. The show ended that night with something that had never happened before in its 5-year history. Instead of the usual light-hearted closing remarks and preview of next week's episode, Hiroshi simply stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the studio audience and then directly into the camera. "Tonight," he said quietly, "we have all witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a beautiful performance, but the discovery of a voice that was hidden for far too long. I think we all have some thinking to do about the music we've never heard and the stories we've never been told." The credits rolled over a shot of the Tanaka twins carefully packing their violins while the studio audience continued to applaud. Heinrich sat in his judge's chair staring at nothing, his mind still processing everything that had happened. Within hours of the show's broadcast, clips of Heinrich's confused attempts to identify the piece were spreading across social media. By the next morning, the video had been viewed over 2 million times on various platforms. The hashtag Our Grandmother's Music was trending not just in Japan but internationally. But something unexpected happened with the viral spread of the story. Instead of the usual internet mockery that often accompanies public embarrassment, most of the response was thoughtful and sympathetic. People seemed to understand that what they had witnessed was bigger than one man's mistake. Heinrich woke up the next morning to find his phone buzzing with dozens of missed calls and text messages. His manager called him in a panic, worried about the damage to his reputation. But as Heinrich read through the messages, he found something surprising. Many of the calls were from journalists, but they weren't asking about his embarrassment. They wanted to know more about Emiko Tanaka and her lost compositions. Music professors from universities around the world were reaching out, eager to study her work. Recording companies were inquiring about the rights to her music. But it was an email from a young music student in Germany that really made Heinrich stop and think. The student wrote about how inspiring it was to see someone with his experience and knowledge admit when he didn't know something. She said it made her feel less afraid of making mistakes in her own musical journey. Heinrich read that email 3 times. He had spent 50 years building a reputation as someone who always had the answers. But maybe there was value in not knowing everything. Maybe there was something to be learned from uncertainty. 2 days after the show aired, Heinrich made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He called the television station and asked to speak with the producer. "I want to do something," he told her. "I want to help people learn about Emiko Tanaka and her music, and I want to find other composers like her, people whose work has been forgotten or ignored." The producer was intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "A new kind of show," Heinrich said. "Not just about identifying famous pieces, but about discovering unknown ones. About finding the voices that history overlooked. Within a month, Heinrich was meeting with the Tanaka family. The twins' parents were overwhelmed by the sudden international attention, but they were also proud to see their mother-in-law's work finally getting recognition. They agreed to let Heinrich help organize proper recordings of all 17 compositions. The first recording session took place in a professional studio in Tokyo. Heinrich had assembled some of Japan's finest musicians to play Emiko's pieces. As he listened to her piano sonatas and chamber music being performed by skilled professionals, he was struck again by the sophistication and emotional depth of her work. But he was also struck by something else. Each piece told a story about a woman trying to balance her artistic dreams with the demands of daily life. He could hear in the music the early morning hours when she composed, the quiet moments stolen between household duties, the determination to keep creating even when no one was listening. The recordings were released 6 months after the television show, and they became an unexpected success. Classical music critics praised Emiko's unique voice and her ability to blend Eastern and Western traditions. The album reached the top 10 on classical music charts in several countries, but Heinrich's transformation was just beginning. He started researching other forgotten composers, particularly women and minorities whose work had been overlooked by traditional classical music institutions. He discovered dozens of talented musicians whose stories had been lost to history. He found Isabella Rodriguez, a Mexican composer from the 1890s who had written beautiful guitar concertos that were never published. He uncovered the work of Samuel Johnson, an African-American pianist from the 1920s, who had composed sophisticated jazz-influenced classical pieces that were ignored by white-dominated concert halls. He learned about Chen Wei-ming, a Chinese composer who had fled to America during World War II and spent 40 years writing music that no one ever performed. Each discovery was like finding a hidden treasure. Heinrich realized that the classical music world he had known and loved was much smaller and less diverse than it should have been. So many voices had been silenced not because they lacked talent, but because they didn't fit the narrow definition of who was allowed to be a serious composer. A year after his embarrassing night on Musical Masters, Heinrich launched his new television show called Hidden Voices. Instead of testing young performers on well-known pieces, the show was dedicated to discovering and performing forgotten music. Each episode featured professional musicians playing works by composers who had been ignored by history. The show became even more popular than Musical Masters had been. Audiences loved learning about these hidden stories and hearing beautiful music they had never encountered before. Music schools started incorporating more diverse composers into their curricula. Publishers began seeking out and printing the works of previously unknown musicians. Heinrich also established the Emiko Tanaka Foundation, dedicated to finding and supporting composers whose work deserved wider recognition. The foundation provided grants for recording forgotten music, funded research into overlooked musicians, and offered scholarships for young composers from underrepresented backgrounds. The Tanaka twins, meanwhile, had become minor celebrities in the classical music world. They performed their grandmother's compositions in concert halls across Asia and Europe. But they also continued their regular musical education, studying both traditional Japanese music and European classical techniques. On the first anniversary of that unforgettable television show, Heinrich was invited back to appear on Musical Masters as a guest. This time he had a very different role. Instead of identifying famous pieces, he was there to talk about the importance of unknown music and forgotten composers. As he sat in the same chair where he had experienced his public humiliation, Heinrich reflected on how much had changed. A year ago, he had thought his knowledge of music was complete. He had believed that the important composers were already well known, that the significant pieces were already in the repertoire. Now he understood how limited his perspective had been. There was an entire universe of beautiful music waiting to be rediscovered, created by people whose stories had been pushed aside by history. The host asked him about that night a year ago, about how it felt to be stumped on live television. Heinrich smiled. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me," he said. "I spent 50 years thinking I knew everything about music. But those two remarkable young girls taught me that the most important thing is not knowing all the answers. The most important thing is staying curious, staying open to discovery." He paused and looked directly into the camera. Emiko Tanaka spent decades composing beautiful music that no one heard. How many other voices are out there waiting to be discovered? How many other grandmothers have boxes of music hidden in their closets? That's what we need to find out. The show ended with a performance of one of Emiko's piano pieces, played by a young musician who had learned it specifically for the broadcast. As the final notes faded, Heinrich felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of discovering something completely new and wonderful. His embarrassment had become his greatest teacher.